Do you remember the exact moment Harold Steptoe screamed at his grubby old dad in that junk-filled filthy yard? Or the heartbreaking scene of young Billy Casper flying his Kestrel across the cold grey northern sky in Kesper? What about Alf Garnett completely losing his mind in his armchair while his family just rolled their eyes? If you are smiling right now because you remember exactly what those scenes felt like, then you are in for an absolute treat today. Welcome back, everyone. Picture this: it's a freezing, foggy evening in 1960s Britain. The local coal heaver is frantically scrubbing the black soot off his face in a tin bath by the fire. The factory boys are literally running out of the gates after a bone-aching 12-hour shift. The bus conductor is rushing to cash in his leather satchel, and mums across the country are hurrying to get the tea on the table and the kids washed. Why the absolute mad rush? Because in exactly half an hour, the entire nation is about to stop. Before we had endless streaming, mobile phones and 100 channels fighting for our attention, we had just one heavy, clunky black and white box sitting in the corner of the front room. You might have even had to put a shilling in the meter just to keep it running. And when that dial clicked, the working class people of Britain sat down together. Today we are taking a friendly stroll down memory lane to look at the top 10 legendary 1960s TV shows. These weren't just broadcasts, they were a mirror showing our gritty, hard-working lives right back at us. And make sure you stick around for our top 3, where we look at a movie that was so shockingly real, it actually forced the British government to change the law. Grab yourself a cup of tea, settle in, and let's turn back the clock. Starting our countdown with number 10, we are heading straight into the deafening, clattering noise of the garment factories. Long before modern health and safety regulations, millions of working-class women spent their days hunched over heavy industrial sewing machines in freezing, lint-filled workshops. They were often paid by the piece, working their fingers to the absolute bone, just to put a hot meal on the table for their families. And that is exactly what the rag trade captured so brilliantly. Whenever the fierce, whistle-blowing shop steward, Paddy, shouted her iconic catchphrase, "Everybody out," the whole nation erupted in laughter. But beneath the brilliant comedy, this show struck a massive chord with the public. It was a genuine nod to the hard-working, sharp-tongued women of the 1960s, who were the absolute backbone of British manufacturing. It showed that while the posh bosses in their tailored suits thought they were in charge of the company, it was actually the women on the factory floor who held the real power. It was a weekly tribute to the camaraderie, the relentless banter, and the unbreakable spirit of the British female workforce. They laughed together, they complained together, and they survived together. But while the women were fiercely ruling the factory floors, what was happening out on the streets? What was going on in those dark, newly built concrete estates? That brings us to our next show. Number 9, Z-Cars, the brutal reality of the new estates. At number 9, we have the police drama that completely shattered the cozy, polite illusion of 1950s television. Before Z-Cars, TV coppers were usually well-spoken gentlemen, solving neat little mysteries in quiet, leafy country villages. But in 1962, Z-Cars hit the screens like a punch to the gut. Set in the fictional, gritty northern overspill estate of Newtown, this show didn't hide from the ugly truth of the changing times. As the old, tight-knit Victorian slums were being knocked down with wrecking balls, working-class families were being uprooted and dumped into massive, soulless concrete tower blocks and sprawling estates. Z-Cars showed the real struggles that came with that massive social shift. It showed the youth gangs, the domestic disputes behind closed doors, the desperate betting shop hustles, and the daily grind of survival. The coppers driving those Ford Zephyr patrol cars weren't perfect heroes. They were flawed, stressed out, and dealing with real mud and real crime. For the first time, millions of working-class people saw their actual harsh reality reflected on television. It was raw, but it was a bit shocking for some of the older generation. Speaking of the older generation, what did they prefer to watch when it came to The Boys in Blue? Number 8. Dixon of Dock Green. The Safe Britain We Lost. Clocking in at number 8, we have the ultimate symbol of the old days, a show that makes millions of people today ache with pure nostalgia. When Police Constable George Dixon looked straight into the camera, tipped his helmet, and warmly said, "Evening all," the whole country took a collective breath and felt entirely safe. Dixon of Dock Green wasn't about high-speed car chases, forensic science, or violent shootouts. It was simply about the local Bobby walking the beat in the East End of London. He was a man who knew every single shopkeeper by name. He knew whose kids were acting up, and he dealt with local scallywags with a firm hand, a stern word, and a bit of mutual respect, rather than immediately reaching for his handcuffs. This show reminds us of a time that feels like a different planet now. A time when front doors were left completely unlocked, when the milk money was safe on the doorstep, when kids played out on the streets until the streetlights came on, and when the local policeman was a respected, trusted pillar of the community. By the way, did you prefer the safe, quiet world of George Dixon, or were you more of a likely lad getting into trouble down the pub on a Friday night? Let me know in the comments below. But what if you weren't an old-school copper? What if you were just a young lad trying to survive the week? That's where our next classic comes in. Number 7. The Likely Lads. The ultimate weekend escape. At number 7 is the ultimate, undisputed story of the British weekend. If you ever worked a mind-numbing, bone-aching shift on a 1960s factory floor, Terry Collier and Bob Ferris from The Likely Lads were basically your best mates. This show perfectly captured that glorious, desperate Friday evening feeling. The graft was finally over. The factory hooter had blown. You had your small brown envelope with your heavy cash pay packet in your pocket, and the only thing that mattered in the entire world was getting down to the local pub before the first bell rang. It showed the true lad culture and brotherhood of the era, the endless banter, the cheap pints of bitter, the disastrous attempts to chat up girls, and the desperate, underlying urge to enjoy your fleeting youth before marriage, mortgages, and responsibility locked you down forever. It was exactly the kind of relatable escapism working men needed after a brutal week of manual labor. But when the weekend was over and the lads grew older, what happened to them? Well, they probably ended up sitting in an armchair just like our next entry. Number 6. Till Death Us Do Part. The East End Generational War. At number 6 we step inside the cramped, smoky, wallpaper-peeling living rooms of the London East End. Alf Garnett in Till Death Us Do Part was undoubtedly the loudest, most controversial man on British television. Yet to millions of viewers tuning in every week, he sounded exactly like their own stubborn fathers or grandfathers. The 1960s was a decade of massive, uncomfortable change. The old-school, war-hardened dock workers and coalmen were suddenly clashing with the new, rebellious, long-haired youth of the swinging 60s. Alf Garnett, sitting in his armchair with a pipe and a terrible temper, represented the old guard furiously trying to hold on to a changing world. His son-in-law, who he famously dubbed a scousegit, represented the new age. The arguments they had over politics, money, and the state of the country were exactly the same arguments echoing in every terraced house across Britain. It was loud, it was argumentative, but it was a masterclass in capturing the generational divide of the working class. From the smoky living rooms of the East End, we travel straight up north to the most famous cobbled street in the world. Number 5. Coronation Street. The Matriarchs of the Cobbles. Halfway through our list at number 5 is a show that needs no introduction. But we aren't talking about the modern soap opera with its sensational storylines. We are talking about the early 1960s black and white gritty episodes of Coronation Street. When it first aired, it was a shockingly realistic window into northern terraced life. This was a world of freezing outside toilets, tin baths in front of the coal fire, and women on their hands and knees scrubbing the front step with a donkey stone. It stopped the nation because it highlighted the sheer terrifying strength of working-class women. The fierce matriarchs like Enna Sharples, sitting in the snug of the Rover's Return with her hairnet and a milk stout, kept the whole street in line with a single glare. The houses were damp, the wages were incredibly low, and life was an endless struggle. But the community spirit was entirely unbreakable. If someone on the street was struggling, the neighbors rallied around. It was a perfect, beautiful reflection of an era where people had absolutely no money, but they had each other. Now for our final TV show before we move to the big screen, we look at the men who didn't have a factory or a boss. Number 4. Steptoe and Son, the street hustle empire. Taking the absolute crown for the weekly TV shows at number 4 is a program that literally emptied pubs and cleared the streets every single week. Steptoe and Son. We have talked before on this channel about how rag and bone men or totters quietly built massive fortunes from other people's rubbish. Well, Albert and Harold Steptoe were the ultimate, legendary totters. Millions of working-class families tuned in to watch that tired, overworked horse pull the wooden cart into their filthy, junk-filled yard in Oil Drum Lane. But underneath the brilliant side-splitting comedy, this was actually a deeply tragic story about the rigid British class system. Harold desperately wanted to better himself. He wanted to read books, appreciate art, and climb out of the grime, the soot, and the poverty. But his manipulative, stubborn, grubby father, Albert, dragged him right back down into the muck every single time. It was visually filthy, it was hilarious, but it perfectly illustrated the feeling of being trapped in your social class. It was the most realistic portrayal of the working class struggle to better yourself ever put on television. Now, as we enter our top 3, we are leaving the weekly television broadcasts behind. We are stepping out of the living room and into the smoky, crowded cinemas to look at the 3 gritty, unforgettable 1960s movies that hit the working class harder than a ton of bricks. Number 3. Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, The Factory Rebel. At number 3 is the ultimate 1960s working-class cinematic masterpiece. If you ever stood at a deafening factory lathe, breathing in hot oil and metal dust for hours on end, Arthur Seaton was your absolute hero. This film captured the new rebellion of the manual worker. His philosophy was simple: work hard for the bosses all week because you have to survive, but the weekend belongs entirely to you. Number 2, Cathy, Come Home. The brutal reality of the 1960s. But while Arthur was fighting the bosses at the factory, our next entry highlighted a tragedy happening quietly on the streets of Britain. Broadcast in 1966, Cathy Come Home literally shocked a quarter of the entire British population into total silence. This wasn't Friday night escapism, it was the brutal, heartbreaking reality of the 1960s housing crisis. It showed how fast a hard-working family could lose everything and spiral into absolute poverty just because of a minor workplace injury. It showed the horror of rat-infested slum landlords and the unimaginable nightmare of having your children taken away. It struck such a nerve of fear that it actually forced the British government to change the laws. Number 1, Kestrel, The Lost Generation of the North. And finally, taking our top spot is the 1969 masterpiece that was less of a film and more of an unflinching documentary of northern life, Kestrel. If you grew up in a Yorkshire mining town, this was your life on the big screen. It captured the absolute biting cold of the freezing mornings. It showed the humiliating reality of a school system where teachers ruled with the cane. And above all, it showed the heavy, inescapable shadow of the local coal mine. The terrifying realization that as soon as you turned 15, the pit was waiting to swallow you up into the darkness. For millions of kids with nothing but hand-me-down clothes, young Billy Casper wasn't just a character, he was them. Finding that Kestrel Hawk was his only piece of beauty in a world covered in coal dust. Casper's is a heartbreaking reflection of a generation with very little money, but an incredible amount of resilience. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Today we have 1,000 shows to watch on demand, but have we ever had anything quite as real or quite as uniting as those grainy broadcasts from the 1960s? Which of these classics brings back the strongest memories for you? Drop your stories in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you miss the grit and honesty of the old days, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Until next time, take care.